Hi and welcome back. I really want to apologize to everybody who was waiting for the Phenomenology in Architecture series. This is probably the most important part of the entire phenomenology in architecture. My entire master's thesis was on essentially using phenomenology in architecture and designing based on its principles. Today, this is the essentially the second main video on phenomenology in architecture and how to design based on its principles. I would like to start by referencing the book that this series is essentially part of. The book that we're referring to is called Questions of Perception, and one of the chapters is written by Stephen Holl. And Stephen Holl is one of the most famous architects in the world, has a lot of designs in China. His hand sketches are really interesting if you look at those. And in that book, he introduces about 13 principles that are used in his designs. And that's what we're going to discover today on what those principles are and how they can potentially help us to get things going. I might be wrong on the 13. Let me just quickly count my notes on how many they were. That's 6, 9, and 11. Actually, sorry about that. 11. The first principle that he refers to is called essentially the merging of the background of what you're designing with your object, whatever it is. It can be a building. And sorry, this is my interpretation of those 11 objects and not what is written in the book. This is pure perception of me of the book. And sorry for that. And the first thing that is very important is the merging of the object and its background. The simplest way to put this is imagining a plant that you have on on a desk with a window in the background and then seeing a scenic view in the background of that window. That's why it's very important, right? You perceive the plant based on its background, and that background impacts you. Even the window itself impacts your perception of that plant, right? And it is very important. You can put it for an architectural project. You can put it for anything that you're trying to frame in your designs, right? If you have a sculpture, if you have a certain room that you want to pay attention to, if you're designing a gallery that is important, the entrance is important for you. It's not just the entrance, it's what's also in the background. It's also in part of your design. All these perspectives, all these backgrounds become essentially one when you have an object. So you're perceiving that object based on this desired background. And that's essentially the first principle of our perception. The second option is that we perceive the world in a series of incomplete perspectives. And what that means is that with every turn or every step that you take, you are seeing a new perspective around you. You're having a new perception of your environment. This might be slow if you're walking in a essentially same path and everything is symmetrical, everything is the same thing. The perspective is changing, but there's not a lot of new information for you to process, right? Because everything is symmetrical, everything is the same. Imagine yourself in a Roman temple or a Greek temple, everything's symmetrical. And it impacts your perception, right? Sometimes you perceive the same path as being very long and arduous and why you're not reaching the destination. Whereas if your perspective is constantly changing and you're perceiving new things along that path, then it might appear to you shorter in terms of perception, if that makes sense. You might have experienced it if you're a hiking person and you go on hikes, you see that that perspective is changing every few minutes. But if you're climbing a mountain straight from the bottom of the mountain to all the way to its top and you're constantly looking, it's very arduous, right? It's very just time consuming, impacting your perception, and essentially elongating the time for you to reach your destination. And those are the things that is important. Now, bringing it back to the architecture, when you are designing the building, depending on what you want to do, you want to make it exciting or you want to make it arduous for the for your visitors or for the users. Depending on what you're designing, you can impact the perception of the space for the people who are using your building, for the people who are just visiting the building or even just visiting from outside, just being a bystander. That impacts the design, right? And that is very important and something that you should always consider. How did I use this in my designs? Essentially because everything is a perspective, and with every step that we take, I sat down and I had a concept of what my design was, what I wanted to do based on what I learned from the site and other things, the program and everything else. And I started to design a path that the person who is on that journey, I was designing a museum, wants to take. And based on that path, I designed a lot of different perspectives and try to constantly make them better to design a very interesting space. That is essentially how you can use it. You can create a bunch of perspectives that shows how the person will perceive the space. The next item that we should talk about is called light and shadow, and that's what it is essentially in the book as well. And what it means is that the light and shadow impacts our perception of our surrounding environment. And that is something very important, right? Imagine the play of light and shadow in Le Corbusier works, right? Very intense. You already know about that. Think about it that you can make spookier, scarier spaces. Just go and look on Pinterest, the play of light and shadow, and see how they look like. You can make it very interesting. Sometimes it's not just about the light that you put on the object, it's also about the reflection of light. If I'm not mistaken, Stephen Hall uses this a lot in his designs as well, where you get the reflection of light going on a surface, coming back on another surface, and then going back on another surface at the same time. And imagine if this light is also colorful, right? That intensifies the entire perception. And that is something you can also see it on how Gothic architects or the essentially the design of all churches are kind of going around that, right? Right? The colorful glasses that are used and the impact they have on us in perceiving a space. If you go to Middle East, the same concept exists, right? There is a lot of different buildings that use these stained glasses to put color into our buildings, and that makes a very interesting perception of the space. You can Google these things. I could do some video edits and put these things on, but you can just quickly uh, search these things and just see how they are. I remember in Persian architecture, there is a mosque, I believe, that is called Shiraz Mosque or Grand Mosque of Shiraz, and it's called Pink Mosque, if I'm not mistaken, which is a lot colorful and it impacts your perception of the space. So that's something you can search, or you're probably familiar with the churches as well. So those are the kind of things that impacts our perception of our surrounding environment. And that is something that you can also use in your designs. Speaking about colors and the stained glass and essentially a light that has color, the next option that we should talk about is based on Stephen Hall's chapter in the questions of perception, is our understanding of color. Sometimes you have the color itself, which is can be strong, can be pale, can be different things. You can use that color in any manner that you want in your design. Sometimes there's no color, depending on what you're designing. But sometimes it's not just about the color. Sometimes the color, as we discussed previously, can be reflected off a surface through light. Sometimes light can go on a surface and intensifies this situation. Our perception of color is very important because it essentially impacts everything surrounding our environment, right? Think about it, such as graffitis or other designs that people use and put into their buildings. That's something very important, right? Understanding colors is an important thing to have, and that's something that you can use in your space. One dominant color can impact your entire perception of the space. It can make it cozy or it can make it very intimidating, right? So those are the important things when it comes to colors for us. The next option that we have is the space of night. The simplest form of this is Las Vegas, right? Just look how it looks like at night with all the lights and how it looks like in the morning. Think about China with all those colorful plays on their surface, on their towers, right? Those are all the important things. Now, even go a little bit into more of our, ancestry and histories. Maybe, I don't know, 500 years ago, the space of night was not that much of a difference, except the fact that it was dark. But now, night is completely different, right? People go to, I don't know, raves, for example, and they have a different perception of night, right? 500 years ago probably didn't exist, or I don't know, maybe there were some sorts of rituals and cults going on, but aside from those, the fact is that the space of night has changed and it's constantly changing, right? And it impacts our design because our building is going to be there at night. How's your building going to be? If you make your building shine, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Is it going to impact the surrounding environment? Is it going to impact the wildlife? Is it going to impact the people who are living next to your building? Very important, right? We all know about the beautiful Christmas lights, right? That people put up, make amazing shows, and everybody loves that, right? That's why some neighborhoods become important. So that the space of night is very important when it comes to design. So that's something that you should intentionally think about. The next option that I want to touch on is perception and time. It's something very interesting and very important. There's so many philosophical books on perception and time that you can essentially refer to learn more about that and familiarize yourself with what philosophers were thinking about the perception and time. But essentially, the passing of time, there's a time that it's going on the clock, but there's also our perception of time, right? Sometimes you spend 2 hours somewhere and it feels like 20 minutes. And sometimes you spend 20 minutes, but it feels like ages. Why? Because it impacts us, right? Our perception of time is really dependent on our surrounding environment as well. Now, if you think about the Grand Station in New York, that's where the light and shadow comes into play, and our perception of time comes into play as well, right? Is it going to be faster? Is it going to be slower? It's a personal experience. Um, but that giant thing where you feel you're suspended somewhere, or you feel you are having a sense of suspense, that impacts your perception. That is very important. The basic example of it I told you earlier, it's climbing the mountain in a straight line, no perspectival changes, just going straight, make it arduous, understand, oh my God, why is it not coming to an end, or changing the perspectives, making it more fun and going things fast, and things go faster for your visitors, or even into nature if you are hiking, right? Those things are important, and that is what it means. The perception of time is impacted by your design, is impacted by what you want to create. The next option that we should talk about it is water. Stephen Hall uses water in his designs, and in one of the buildings, I'm not sure if the architect was Stephen Hall or not, or it's one of his projects or not. I cannot remember right now. But essentially, there's an apartment, and there is some sort of a fountain, or not a fountain, one of the designs that there's a layer of water. And what it does is it reflects the building in the water, number one. That's one way it impacts the perception. It's a new lens of that building, right? For that building. So it reflects the building and surrounding environment. You also do that in lakes and other spaces. The second option is that you can also see the nature and surrounding in that water. You can look into the water and see the sky, right? And that's something that is very important. That is something that impacts us in a very, I would say, profound way, right? And the third thing is that the water can also impact us in terms of our understanding and perception of surrounding environment. What does that mean? That means when it rains, you see that the roads are wet. But once the rain stopped, one of the ways that people quickly check when they're having their umbrellas on to see is it still raining or not, it's either moving the umbrella to see if they get wet, or they just look at the puddles and is there a rain hitting the water? That's the simplest way, right? Water is an amazing lens that can make us aware of our surrounding environment. Is it raining? Is there cloud in the sky reflect? Is there cloud in the sky reflecting in the water? Those are all important things, right? When you want to design that, that's why I also love having some sort of a water layer in my buildings. It impacts our perception. It makes us aware of our surrounding. It intensifies our perception of our environment, and that's why all important. And the next option that comes to mind is what I call it the sound, right? And that's what in the Stephen Hall book as well, the questions of perception. Go back to the example of water And when the water is heating our essentially the rain is hitting the puddles, you hear something, right? And that sound impacts your perception. That's why maybe you like walking when it's raining. Think about fall when there's a lot of leaves on the ground and you're walking and you hear that of walking on the ground of those leaves, right? And that impacts your perception of the environment. You know it's fall. You know that you're walking on leaves. Put that in architecture. The sound of water going around can impact our perception. The background sound of people can impact our perception. Imagine you have a coffee shop in your building. That impacts the perception of your building, right? You don't want to design a museum where you want people to contemplate and be quiet and then have a coffee shop next to it where there's a huge background noise now for your design, right? Nobody wants that if that's the intention of your design. So that sound impacts essentially our designs, right? And that is the next major option for us. The next important thing is called details. And details really matter because it can be a realm of sensations, right? Think about a concrete with a certain texture versus a concrete or a wood in your design. Those details impact your perception. They also impact our sensations in a way that when you see a rough surface, you have an idea of how that surface will feel if you touch it, right? Our brain is smart. We can understand those things, and those things are what make great designs, right? Because now you see it, you perceive it. If you want, you can touch it as well, or you can just skip it depending on what is going on. Imagine a handrail that you're going to grab and it's metal. Should be metal, should be zinc, should be brushed metal. What is going to be, right? All those things impact our designs and impact architecture in general. The next option that I really love personally is called proportions, scale, and our perception. And this is very important. And why that is important is because think about a huge design that you have. You want to design something that somebody feels not as big as universe, right? That's in, for example, religious architecture. You want to show that the universe is so huge, right? And you are just a member of that universe and you should be like surrendering or whatever concepts that they were using. Not getting into those details of those designs, but that is the idea, right? The proportions are important in your design. The proportions, the amount of space that you have, is it proportionate to the other parts of your building? If you're designing a coffee shop and then a socializing space and then another multi-purpose space, are all these things proportional to each other? Or do you want to make the proportions different? The design proportions, the facade, the space, everything is important, right? And that's something that you easily know, right? That we perceive all those things. And the last option is your site circumstances and your ideas are unique to that site and circumstances. Each design is unique, right? The functions can be same. The essentially your source of inspiration can be the same as another project, but it is unique to that site. It is unique to the designer, to you as an architect, where you are designing the building. And that's important because that shapes a lot of different things, right? You can bring new ideas, you can be inspired by others and take those ideas and take them to the next step, right? And all those things are essentially super important for us. These 11 components of that impact and shape our understanding are important for us as architects because we have to use these things intentionally in our designs in order to make better designs. And that is something super important. That is something that I believe Stephen Hall was trying to mention in that book and bringing these things up and understanding that these 11 different components work together, merge together, and shape our perception, right? We also have the us as the people who are perceiving it, and then wildlife that might be perceiving our building as well. Even the plant lives, they're important, right? You know that the artificial light impacts the plant cycle, right? So everything is impacted, everything is merged together essentially. And I believe that's what the Stephen Hall made in this. From that perspectival merging to our impact on acoustics from the essentially the sounds that we receive, and everything else is going to shape our perception of architecture. And that's my understanding of phenomenology in architecture, and was one of the main guiding principles for me when I was designing my buildings, when I was essentially architecting as the verb. Um, and that's, I think, is very super important. Apologies again if this video was a little bit late, but I hope it helps people who are looking forward to integrating phenomenology in architecture with their designs. And I hope that this video is helpful to you. I'm probably going to share my design somewhere, maybe on my website. I'm still deciding. So that when I talk about these things, what do they mean? And what are the ideas going to be? I might even upload them on Pinterest. I'll keep you guys posted. I'll try to explain everything I explained in this in the project, and you can see how things are going to work in that project. And I think that would be helpful. But that is so far my master's thesis, and I think that's how it essentially shaped my designs. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being patient with me and waiting for these videos. And I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you.